In this world, we have no problem of getting rid of or exterminating something because it doesn't fit the image that we want. Without remorse and without ignorance, we eradicate living things from where we live because it makes our lives more difficult. Instead of making a compromise, we choose to get rid of the problem completely. Hello, my name is Katie Craver, and I'm here to talk to you about an example of this, and that example being the extermination of almost every single gray wolf from the Yellowstone National Area and the effects of it. The event that it caused was that it caused the ecosystem to go under drastic changes, and it is still recovering from it today. My reasoning for talking about it with you guys today is because I've always been interested in the environment and the wildlife that lives on this planet. When I was a senior in high school, we had to choose a topic on an environmental crisis, and this was the one that I immediately chose. Once I looked up the topic wolves in Yellowstone, I was hooked. And that's why I'm teaching you guys today about the event and the events that happened afterwards. With many things, the world takes advantage of the earth for our own wants, or just simply to make it easier for us or to make it look better. And this is one big example of it. It all started in the early 1800s when the Europeans and logging companies started settling into the United States. This was also the time that the wolves started to be hunted. The reason why was from, in quote, Wisconsin Wolf Advisory Committee. It says, negative attitude towards wolves prevailed amongst Europeans who settled in the territory in the late 1830s. After the end of the Civil War, wolves were perceived as a menace to livestock, and in response, the state legislature instituted a bounty in 1865. They were basically considered as nuisance predators who only hunted down their livestock and lost money for the people and killed their animals. So they thought, hey, why not? Let's just get rid of them completely. There's no reason for them. Without making a compromise, humans decided to get rid of the problem completely, not knowing the consequences. Other things that they did to get rid of the wolves was bounty programs. From the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, bounty programs initiated in the 19th century continued as late as 1965, offering $20 to $50 per wolf. Wolves were trapped, shot, drugged from their dens, and hunted with dogs. They were also given poisoned animal carcasses and left out for the wolves, a practice that also killed eagles, ravens, foxes, bears, and other animals that fed on the tainted carrion. Camilla Fox states in her blog from the HuffPost, an Animal Damage Control Act, which was passed in 1931, authorized the Secretary of Agriculture to conduct campaigns for the destruction of control of animals considered to be threats to agriculture or ranching interests. Under this arcane law, government agents continue to trap, snare, poison, and shoot any animal that may harm livestock and aquaculture or agriculture crops. Under this act, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Wildlife Services program conducts its quiet, relentless war against North America's wildlife. In 2009 alone, this act killed over 4 million animals, and it continues to do so today. Another reason why the wolves were killed so many in the Yellowstone National Park area was because the national park did not provide protection for wolves or other wildlife. The government predator control programs in the first decades of the 1900s essentially helped eliminate the gray wolf from Yellowstone. So basically anyone who went there, worked, toured, or hunted could go in there and kill any game or predator that they thought they wanted. This lasted for many years, and after the wolves were almost completely hunted out of the park, scientists started seeing changes in the national park's ecosystem, food chain, and surrounding wildlife. They started to notice the effect that the wolves actually did have on the park. After terminating the wolves almost completely, the one big thing that they noticed was that there was barely anything to eat the elk. While the wolves were there, elks were trained to have behaviors to stay away from certain areas, to stay away from rivers or certain plains in order to not get ambushed. But since there were no wolves to avoid, these elk did not need to have these behaviors anymore. Therefore, they reproduced rapidly to the point where it became a massive problem. From the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, elk changed their behavior to avoid wolf predation, which allowed willow, aspen, and cottonwood regrowth. This in turn provided food for beavers and habitat for songbirds. However, since there were no wolves to avoid, the behavior of the elk changed, and they did not need to avoid areas, therefore grazing anywhere. The willow, aspen, and cottonwood were eaten faster than they could reproduce. Plant life at the edges of the river and other bodies of water in the park had been eaten so much that they had now been vulnerable to erosion. The overeating and erosion led to changes in the bodies of the water. The rivers and the bodies of water actually changed shape in the park, and they did not look the same as they did before. Also, other animals became affected after the elk started rising in population greatly. Aquatic species and birds inhabiting the park began to decline. Waters became broader and shallower because there were no plants at the river's edge to keep the shade and cooling of the rivers. And birds started losing nesting because of the decrease of trees and plant life in the area. Another animal that was greatly affected was the beaver. Since there was much less plant life, they had much less trees and plants to use for their dams. And without enough material from them, they couldn't make their housing. And with this, beavers were not able to survive in the park because of a loss of resources. After seeing the effects of what had been done to the park, a slow rehabilitation process began and allowed the park to rejuvenate. However, this rehabilitation was slow and a reluctant process. After many years, restoration brings back wolves into the Yellowstone National Park and its surrounding states, allowing the park to rejuvenate. After 70 years, the wolves were slowly brought back in only because of reasoning, because the elk population got so out of control, and because the wolves were put back on the endangered species list. People knew that this was a problem, and they thought that it would be best to bring them back, so they were slowly brought back in 1995. Once reintroduced, changes started to reverse immediately. The elk's abundant population gave the wolves all the fuel that they needed that was necessary, and the elk started going back to their original behaviors. With this, the willow, aspen, and cottonwood was able to grow back shortly, and this eventually allowed the return of species of fish, birds, and beavers. After the wolves were brought in, a slow renunciation began with the plant life and wildlife that lived in the park. It was reverted back to their own original behaviors and started the process to bring back the park to what it once was. In conclusion, everything in this world makes an impact, including our choices. While Yellowstone is still in rehabilitation, it stands as an example that our choices make big impacts and we need to think more before we act. Thank you.